It's a good question. It's in some ways less than one might think. The Americans, of course, have their fingers in a lot of pies. These were pretty unanticipated rebellions, and the United States faced some hard choices, right? It was a big supporter of the Mubarak regime, for example, in Egypt, and which became very unpopular. There were popular protests to remove him, and it was a difficult choice to say, you know what, we think you ought to leave. But what we didn't like was what came after, which was an Islamist regime. And then we were sort of signed off on the military removing that regime because it was more in our interests than the Islamist regime. Now, of course, there were some obvious American interventions. Libya was being the key one, where there's disputes about how much of a humanitarian disaster was going to happen in Libya, but we certainly took that as an excuse or some kind of excuse to remove Gaddafi, who was a giant thorn in everyone's side. And then in Syria, the United States and its allies tried to, put its thumb on the scale of the rebels, the initial rebels who were thought to be more moderate in their goals. But ultimately that was totally unsuccessful. It mainly consisted of arming and training rebels, giving them lots of equipment that eventually ended up in the hands, much of it, of extremist Islamist groups. And the Obama administration decided that wasn't going to work and cleared the way, for other interveners to come and support the government, i.e. Iran and the Russians. In Tunisia, right, it's just very hard to predict what happens after these revolutions occur. Again, in a place that hadn't had a lot of experience with democratic rule, and what you see is backsliding, which is not, too surprising that once leaders get elected, they're like, hey, this is pretty good. I'd like to stay here. Let's change the law about term limits. Let's suspend the powers of the parliament. Let's stack the judicial system with our friendly appointees. It's in a country with that kind of tradition where a dictator ruled for a long time, there's pretty weak constraints, and it's not going to be an instantaneous transformation.